What happens when a 12-year-old Amish boy with trembling hands stands behind a humble milk cart, selling bottles to fund his own chemotherapy? In a world where an Amish father's pride collides with his son's survival, the arrival of Morgan Freeman at Whispering Creek Farmers Market changes everything. While filming nearby, Freeman discovers Eli Yoder counting each dollar earned, not for candy or toys, but for leukemia treatments his father refuses to accept as charity. The acclaimed actor faces an impossible challenge: how to help a child whose community rejects outside assistance on principle. The solution wasn't a Hollywood-sized donation, but a business plan that would preserve Amish dignity while saving a boy's life. What began with one bottle of milk would heal not just Eli, but the invisible divide between two worlds that had existed side by side for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist hung low over Whispering Creek Farmers Market, painting the autumn morning in watercolor shades of gray. Dew clung to every surface, glistening on the wooden stalls and hand-lettered signs that dotted the gravel pathways. It was the kind of Pennsylvania morning that felt like a secret, quiet enough to hear the gentle clinking of glass, the murmur of early customers, and the clip-clop of horses' hooves arriving with the day's fresh goods. Eli Yoder stood behind his simple, wooden cart, his straw hat pulled low over his forehead. At 12 years old, he was younger than most vendors, but his hands moved with practiced precision as he poured fresh, raw milk from a large metal container into glass bottles. The sleeves of his homespun blue shirt were rolled up despite the morning chill, revealing forearms thin but strong from farm work. His hands trembled slightly as he secured each lid, a tremor he couldn't quite control these days. The chemotherapy did that to him, little reminders that his body was at war with itself. He flexed his fingers briefly, then continued working, never letting his discomfort show on his face. An Amish boy did not complain. An Amish boy accepted God's will with grace and humility, even if that will was leukemia. "Morning, Eli," said Mrs. Hoffler, a regular customer who taught at the local elementary school. "How many bottles do you have today?" 24, ma'am," Eli answered, his voice soft but clear. "Fresh this morning." She studied his face, noting the shadows beneath his eyes, the pallor of his skin despite the hours he spent in the fields. "How are you feeling today, son?" Eli nodded politely, his expression revealing nothing. "God provides." It was the answer he always gave. It was the answer his father had taught him to give. The truth, that he had vomited twice before dawn, that his joints ached as though he'd aged 70 years overnight, that he'd prayed until his throat was raw for strength to make it through this day, remained unspoken. Mrs. Hoffler bought 2 bottles, pressing the money into his palm with a gentle squeeze. "Tell your mother I'll bring by some of those honey biscuits she likes next week." Eli nodded again, carefully counting out her change. Each dollar was one step closer. 3 stalls. Down Morgan Freeman paused to inspect a display of hand-carved wooden spoons. He hadn't planned to visit the market that morning. In fact, he hadn't planned to be in Pennsylvania at all. But when the director had suggested this location for their upcoming film, "There's a quality to the light here, Morgan, you'll see." He'd agreed to come scout it personally. Now dressed in jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and a baseball cap, he blended in with the locals. No one seemed to recognize him, which was exactly how he preferred it. These brief moments of anonymity were precious. They allowed him to observe, to listen, to gather the small details of ordinary lives that made his performances ring true. Morgan moved unhurriedly through the market, stopping occasionally to sample local honey or admire handmade quilts. It was the boy that caught his attention first, so young to be working alone, so serious in his movements. There was something in the way he carried himself, as if bearing a weight far beyond his years. As Morgan drifted closer, he overheard Mrs. Hoffler's question, "How's your health, son?" and saw the boy's practiced non-answer. Intrigued, he stopped before the wooden cart with its hand-painted sign, "Yoder Family Dairy, fresh raw milk, $5. "Good morning," Morgan said, his voice carrying its characteristic gentle rumble. The boy looked up, polite but reserved. "Morning, sir. I'd like a bottle of your milk." Morgan studied the display. "Is it from your family's farm?" "Yes, sir. Our farm is about 3 miles from here." Eli selected a bottle, wiping it clean with a cloth before handing it over. "Best milk in the county. My father says it's because we treat our cows like family." Morgan smiled, noting how the boy's hands shook slightly as he accepted payment. "I believe that. Animals know when they're respected." Eli counted out change carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "No rush," Morgan assured him. "I've got nowhere to be." The boy glanced up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face at the stranger's patience. Most English, the Amish term for non-Amish, were always in a hurry. "You don't usually work the booth alone?" Morgan asked conversationally. "My brother Jacob usually helps, but he's helping with barn repairs today." Eli straightened the bottles in precise rows. "I need to sell as many as I can anyway. Doctors' bills don't pay themselves." It was said so matter-of-factly, without self-pity, that it took Morgan a moment to process the words. "Doctor's bills?" he asked carefully. Eli seemed to realize he'd said too much. He looked down, adjusting his hat. "It's nothing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry," Morgan said, his voice gentle. "I was just concerned." The boy looked up then, studying Morgan's face. Whatever he saw there, kindness perhaps or genuine concern, loosened his tongue slightly. "I'm sick," he said simply. "Our community helps when they can, but my father doesn't believe in accepting charity from outsiders. Says it's not our way." He shrugged, a gesture too old for his young shoulders. "But I can still work?" Morgan felt something tighten in his chest. "You're working to pay for your own medical care?" "Just doing my part," Eli replied, as if this were the most natural thing in the world for a child his age. "Each bottle gets me closer." Before Morgan could respond, another customer approached, and Eli turned his attention to them with the same quiet focus. Morgan stepped aside, but something kept him from walking away entirely. He stood a few feet from the booth, sipping his milk, which was indeed excellent, and watching as Eli served his customers with unfailing politeness. An hour passed. The market grew busier, but the boy never took a break. Once, Morgan saw him discreetly steady himself against the cart, eyes closed briefly as if fighting a wave of dizziness. When he opened them again, his expression was composed, revealing nothing. As the morning crowd began to thin, Morgan approached the cart once more. Only 7 bottles remained. "I've got some friends staying at the hotel," Morgan said. "They'd appreciate some good fresh milk. How about I take what you have left?" Eli's eyes widened slightly. "All of them?" "If that's all right." The boy hesitated, then nodded, carefully wrapping each bottle in brown paper before placing them in a wooden crate. "That's $35, he said, his voice steady despite the surprise Morgan could see in his eyes. Morgan handed him 2 20s. "Keep the change." "No, sir." Eli immediately reached for the cash box. "I need to give you your $5 back." Morgan was struck by the boy's integrity. Here was a child literally working to save his own life, yet unwilling to accept even $5 extra. "Tell you what," Morgan said. "How about I pay $40 for all 7 bottles? That's a fair price for milk this good." Eli considered this, then nodded slowly. "That would be fair." He put away one of the 20s and handed Morgan $5 change from the other. As Morgan picked up the crate, he asked casually, "Will you be here tomorrow?" "Yes, sir, every day except Sunday." "Then I'll see you tomorrow," Morgan said, smiling gently. He walked away, the crate of milk heavy in his arms, but his thoughts were heavier still. There was a story here, one that pulled at him in a way he couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity in the boy's eyes, or the tremor in his hands that he tried so hard to hide. Whatever it was, Morgan knew he wouldn't be able to simply walk away. That night in his hotel room, Morgan sat by the window overlooking the town. He'd distributed the milk among the film crew, who'd been surprised but pleased by the gesture. But the bottles weren't what had stayed with him. It was the image of Eli Yoder, a child bearing an adult's burden with such quiet grace. He picked up his phone, hesitated, then dialed the number of a local contact the production company had provided. "Tom, it's Morgan Freeman. I need to find out about a family in the area, the Yoders, Amish family with a boy named Eli." He paused, listening to the response. "Yes, it's important. Very important." Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, the droplets catching the light of the street lamps below. Morgan watched them trace patterns down the glass, like tears on a face too proud to shed them. He had come to Pennsylvania to find the right setting for a film. Instead, he'd found a boy selling milk to save his own life, and a story that wouldn't let him go. Morgan sat in the waiting room of Whispering Creek Medical Center, a modest brick building on the edge of town. The antiseptic smell, the hum of fluorescent lights, the outdated magazines, all were familiar features of hospitals everywhere. Yet there was something distinctly small town about this one. A handmade quilt hung on one wall, and a bulletin. Board overflowed with community announcements. An elderly woman with a walker smiled at him as she shuffled past. "You're that movie fellow, aren't you?" Morgan nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. Thought so. My grandson loves your movies." She patted his shoulder. "Whatever brings you here. I hope it all works out." Before Morgan could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Freeman, Dr. Carter will see you now." The oncologist's office was small but tidy, with medical diplomas sharing wall space with children's artwork. Dr. Angela Carter herself was a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much suffering to be truly young anymore. "Mr. Freeman," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "This is quite unexpected. When my receptionist said you were waiting, I thought she was joking." "I appreciate you seeing me without an appointment," Morgan replied, taking the seat she offered. "Of course." She settled behind her desk. "Though I have to say, you look healthy enough to me." A small smile softened her professional demeanor. "I'm not here for myself, doctor." Morgan leaned forward slightly. "I met a young boy today, Eli Yoder." The smile faded from Dr. Carter's face. She folded her hands on the desk, her expression carefully neutral. "I see. He mentioned medical bills, doctor's bills specifically, and I couldn't help but notice that he didn't look well." Dr. Carter sighed. "Mr. Freeman, I'm sure you understand. Patient confidentiality." "I'm not asking for his medical records," Morgan interrupted gently, "but I saw a 12-year-old boy working to pay for what I suspect is his own treatment. I'd like to help, but first I need to understand the situation." She studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "What I can tell you is that there are children in this community with serious medical conditions, and yes, some of them are from Amish families, which presents unique challenges." "What kind of challenges?" "The Amish approach healthcare differently than most Americans," she explained. "They don't believe in insurance. Medical expenses are paid out of pocket or through community aid. They're not against modern medicine per se, but they believe in accepting God's will, whatever that may be." Morgan nodded. "And accepting help from outsiders?" "Generally discouraged, especially if it seems like charity." Dr. Carter ran a hand over her ponytail, a gesture that suggested this was a familiar frustration. "Mr. Freeman, without speaking about any specific patient, I can tell you that childhood leukemia is treatable, with good survival rates. But the treatment is intensive, expensive, and can last for years." The implication hung heavy in the air, between them. "How expensive?" Morgan asked quietly. "Hundreds of thousands of dollars." Her voice was equally soft. "Sometimes more." Morgan let out a slow breath. "And a family selling raw milk at a farmer's market would struggle to cover even a fraction of that cost." She completed his thought. "We do what we can. There are programs, sliding scales, assistance options. But for families who refuse outside help on principle..." She trailed off, and Morgan could see the genuine concern in her eyes. This wasn't just a professional speaking. This was someone who cared deeply about her patients. "Is there anything that can be done?" he asked. "Any way to help that wouldn't violate their beliefs?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "The Amish do accept help in certain forms, work exchanges, for instance. They value labor, self-sufficiency. If someone were to, say, purchase goods or services at a fair price, even at a premium, that wouldn't be seen as charity." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Freeman, I don't know what you're planning, but these are proud people with deep-rooted beliefs. If you're thinking of helping, tread carefully." "I understand." Morgan stood, extending his hand. "Thank you, Doctor. You've been very helpful." As he turned to leave, Dr. Carter called after him. "Mr. Freeman?" He paused at the door. "Whatever you're considering, time matters in these cases." The weight of her words followed him out into the evening air. The directions Tom had given him led Morgan along narrow country roads where asphalt gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across fields where crops stood in neat rows. Twice he passed black buggies, the clip-clop of hooves a rhythmic counterpoint to his car's engine. The Yoder farm appeared around a gentle bend, a white farmhouse with a sweeping porch, a large red barn, and several outbuildings arranged in a neat cluster. No power lines connected to the house. Instead, Morgan noticed a windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. Clotheslines held plain dresses and shirts, stiffening in the autumn air. As he pulled into the gravel drive, Morgan saw a tall young man in a straw hat pause in his work of unhitching a horse from a buggy. This would be Jacob, he guessed, Eli's older brother. Morgan stepped out of his car, conscious that he was an intruder here. The young man watched him warily, his hands continuing their practiced work. "Good evening," Morgan called, his voice carrying across the yard. "I'm looking for Mr. Yoder." The young man said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward the barn. Following his gaze, Morgan saw an older man emerge, wiping his hands on a cloth. Abraham Yoder was tall like his son, with a full beard but no mustache, the traditional appearance of a married Amish man. Deep lines etched his weathered face, and his eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to hard work and harder decisions. "I am Abraham Yoder," he said as he approached, his voice carrying a slight German accent. "What brings an Englisher to my home this evening?" "My name is Morgan Freeman, sir." He extended his hand, which Abraham shook briefly but firmly. "I met your son Eli at the market today." Abraham's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Concern, perhaps, or wariness. "Is there a problem with the milk?" "No, sir. The milk is excellent." Morgan chose his next words carefully. "I was hoping to speak with you about Eli. I understand he's been ill." The change was immediate. Abraham's posture stiffened and his face closed like a door being shut. "My son's health is a family matter, Mr. Freeman." From the corner of his eye, Morgan noticed Jacob had stopped working and was listening intently. Beyond him, the farmhouse door had opened slightly, and a woman's figure stood in the shadows of the porch. Miriam Yoder, he presumed. "I understand that, sir, and I respect your privacy," Morgan said. "I only wanted to offer my assistance. I have resources that could help with Eli's medical costs." Abraham shook his head firmly. "We do not accept charity, Mr. Freeman. It is not our way." "It wouldn't have to be charity," Morgan pressed gently. "Perhaps a business arrangement of some kind. Mr. Freeman." Abraham's tone was polite but unyielding. "Our community cares for its own. We have managed without outside help for hundreds of years, and we will continue to do so." He gestured toward the sky, now painted in deepening shades of orange and purple. "God provides for his children in his own way." Morgan had encountered many forms of pride in his life, but never one so deeply intertwined with faith. This wasn't stubbornness or arrogance. It was the bedrock of a belief system that had sustained generations. "I mean no disrespect to your ways," Morgan said carefully, "but sometimes God's provision comes through unexpected channels." For a moment, Something like uncertainty crossed Abraham's face. Then his expression hardened once more. "We thank you for your concern, but it is unnecessary." He took a step back, a clear indication that the conversation was over. "Now, if you'll excuse me, there is work to be finished before dark." Morgan knew pushing further would only strengthen the man's resolve. He nodded, accepting defeat for now. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Yoder. If you change your mind, I'm staying at the Whispering Creek Inn in town." As he turned to leave, he caught sight of Jacob again. The young man's eyes held a conflict that his father's did not: doubt, frustration, perhaps even anger. When their gazes met, Jacob quickly looked away, but not before Morgan recognized the silent plea there. At the edge of the yard, Morgan paused and looked back. Abraham had returned to the barn, his back straight, his steps purposeful. Jacob was leading the horse to a paddock, his movements mechanical. And on the porch, the woman's figure lingered, one hand pressed against the doorframe as if for support. The weight of their unspoken suffering hung in the air like the evening mist now rising from the fields. This wasn't just about a sick child, it was about a family stretched to its breaking point, bound by traditions they couldn't abandon, but that might cost them what they loved most. As Morgan drove away, the farm growing smaller in his rearview mirror, he knew that simply throwing money at the problem wouldn't work. Abraham Yoder would refuse it, and rightfully so. It would be asking him to compromise everything he believed in during his darkest hour. But there had to be another way. The image of Eli's trembling hands carefully counting change refused to leave him. Somewhere between the unyielding principles of the Amish and the urgent necessities of modern medicine, there had to be a path forward. Morgan just had to find it. The Whispering Creek Diner sat on Main Street. Its windows steamed from the warmth within. At 6 a.m. it was already half full with farmers, truck drivers, and early shift workers fueling, up before the day began. Morgan slid into a corner booth, nodding politely to the curious glances sent his way. The waitress, Doris according to her name tag, approached with a coffee pot in hand, and recognition dawning in her eyes. "Well, I'll be," she said, filling his cup without asking. "Marge at the inn said we had a celebrity in town, but I didn't believe her." Morgan smiled. "Just passing through, ma'am, scouting locations for a film." "And ordering the breakfast special, I hope," she replied with a wink. "Best pancakes in 3 counties. Sounds perfect." As Doris walked away, Morgan noticed an older man watching him from the counter. After a moment's hesitation, the man picked up his own coffee and approached. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice gravelly from what Morgan guessed were years of cigarettes. "Name's Frank Miller. I'm the postmaster around here." Morgan gestured to the seat across from him. "Please do." Frank settled into the booth with the ease of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Word is you're asking questions about the Yoder family." Morgan studied him carefully. In small towns, news traveled fast, but this was impressive even by those standards. "Word travels quickly," Frank shrugged. "Tom Brennan called me last night. Said you seemed mighty interested in Abraham Yoder's boy." He took a sip of coffee. "Thought you might like to know a few things about the Yoders before you go charging in like some Hollywood white knight." There was no malice in his tone, just the straightforward manner of someone who'd seen outsiders come and go, rarely understanding the complexities of the place they were passing through. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Miller." "Just Frank." He set down his cup. "First thing you should know is that the Amish don't like attention. They won't thank you for singling them out, even if your intentions are good." "I gathered that from my conversation with Abraham yesterday." Frank nodded. "Stubborn as they come, that one. But there's more to it than stubbornness." He leaned forward slightly. 5 years ago, we had a bad flood. Creek rose 8 feet in a night, washed out half the bridges in the county, cut off the northeastern farms completely. He paused as Doris returned with Morgan's breakfast and a refill for both their coffees. "The Amish were the first ones there," Frank continued after she left. "Abraham Yoder led 20 men with horses and wagons full of food, blankets, tools. They worked for 2 weeks straight, rebuilding bridges, repairing homes, bringing supplies. Never asked for a dime." Morgan listened intently, the pancakes forgotten before him. 3 years ago, the Millers, no relation to me, lost their daughter in a car accident. Their barn caught fire the next month, like salt in the wound. Before, they'd even buried their girl. The Amish raised them a new barn. 40 men showed up at dawn, and by sunset that barn was standing. Frank took another sip of coffee. Last winter, old Mrs. Crawford slipped on ice, broke her hip. Lives alone, no family nearby. Every morning for 3 months, one of the Yoder children brought her fresh bread and milk. Wouldn't take payment. The pattern was becoming clear. They help when others are in need, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. Frank nodded. That's their way. Morgan thought about this. So, the town wants to help Eli, but the family won't accept it. It's killing folks. Watching that boy work himself sick trying to pay for treatments that cost more than most people here make in a year. Frank's weathered face showed genuine pain. We've tried collection jars, fundraisers. Abraham always finds out, always returns every penny. There has to be a way, Morgan said almost to himself. Frank studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. If you're serious about helping, you'll need to do it their way. No charity, no handouts. The Amish believe in work, in fair exchange. Milk, Morgan said suddenly. Eli sells milk. Best raw milk in the county. Yoders keep their dairy operations spotless, their cows healthy. People would buy more if they could get it regularly. An idea began to take shape in Morgan's mind. What if there was a way to increase demand? A subscription service of sorts? Frank's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Might work. Folks around here are loyal. They'd pay premium for Yoder milk if they knew it was helping Eli, especially if they didn't have to call it charity. Morgan nodded, the plan crystallizing. I need to make some calls, and I'll need your help, Frank. The older man grinned. Been waiting for someone to figure out how to crack Abraham Yoder's pride. Count me in. By mid-morning, Morgan had secured a small office above the hardware store as his temporary headquarters. The owner, upon learning of Morgan's plan, had offered it rent-free. My wife's grandmother was Amish, he'd explained. Some traditions are worth keeping, others need bending. This is one worth bending for. Morgan worked the phones, calling in favors from the film crew, local businesses, and anyone Frank suggested might help. By noon, a steady stream of visitors came through the door, each offering support in their own way. Sarah Jenkins, the town's web designer, volunteered to create a simple online ordering system. Nothing fancy, she assured Morgan. Just a way for people to sign up for regular deliveries. The owner of the local print shop arrived with freshly made flyers announcing the Yoder Family Premium Milk Subscription Program. On the house, he said, dropping the stack on the desk. My boy was in Eli's class before they pulled him out for treatments. Mid-afternoon brought Dr. Carter, who appeared with a folder tucked under her arm. I can't discuss specific cases, she reminded Morgan, but I can tell you that a consistent income source would make a significant difference for a family facing ongoing medical expenses. By evening, the plan was set. Morgan would buy out Eli's entire stock the next day, and the next and the next, while the townspeople spread word of the subscription program. For a premium price, customers would receive regular deliveries of Yoder milk, with a portion set aside specifically for Eli's treatments. It's not charity, Frank said as they reviewed the details. It's business, fair payment for quality goods. Will Abraham see it that way? Morgan asked. Frank considered this. He's proud, not blind. If people genuinely want his milk and are willing to pay for it, he'll accept that as honest work. As the meeting broke up, an elderly woman who had been quietly listening from the corner approached Morgan. Mr. Freeman, she said, her voice soft but clear. I'm Martha Stoltzfus. My family left the Amish community when I was a girl, but I still have connections there. Morgan nodded encouragingly. What you're doing for Eli, it's good. But you should know that Abraham's pride isn't just about refusing help. It's about believing that God provides through their own hands, their own work. I understand, Morgan said. She smiled gently. I hope so. Because the moment he suspects this is charity disguised as business, he'll walk away, and Eli will suffer for it. The weight of her words settled on Morgan's shoulders. This wasn't just about finding a loophole in Amish tradition. It was about honoring the very essence of their beliefs while still providing the help Eli desperately needed. "Thank you, Mrs. Stoltzfus," he said. "I'll remember that." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Morgan arrived at the farmer's market just as Eli was setting up his stand, carefully arranging bottles of milk in neat rows. The boy looked tired, the shadows under his eyes darker than before, but his movements were deliberate, focused. "Good morning, Eli," Morgan greeted him. Eli looked up, surprise crossing his face before he schooled it back to politeness. "Morning. Sir, you came back." "I said I would." Morgan surveyed the display. "How many bottles do you have today?" 20, Eli replied. "We had a good milking yesterday." Morgan nodded. "I'd like to buy them all." Eli's eyes widened slightly. "All of them? If that's all right." "My crew enjoyed the milk so much yesterday they asked for more." The boy hesitated, clearly torn between excitement at the large sale and suspicion at its unusualness. "That would be $100. Morgan counted out the bills and handed them over. As Eli carefully stored the money in his cash box, Morgan added casually, "Actually, I was wondering if we could arrange a standing order. My crew will be here for several weeks and they're particular about fresh dairy." "A standing order?" Eli repeated, the concept clearly unfamiliar. "A regular purchase. Every day you come to market. 20 bottles. Same price. Would that be possible?" Eli considered this, a flicker of hope crossing his face before he suppressed it. "I would need to ask my father. We don't always have 20 bottles to spare." "Of course," Morgan said smoothly. "Whatever you can provide, we'll pay for what you bring." He gestured to the empty crate. "Could I help you carry those to my car?" As they walked to the parking lot, Morgan noticed Eli's slight limp, the careful way he balanced himself. The effects of chemotherapy were evident in his thin frame and pallor, but the boy's determination never wavered. "Eli," Morgan said as they reached his car, "I wanted to thank you." "For what, sir?" "For reminding me of something important." Morgan smiled gently. "That true strength isn't about physical power. It's about doing what needs to be done, no matter how difficult." Eli looked up at him, confusion in his eyes. "I'm just selling milk." "No," Morgan said quietly. "You're doing much more than that." As Morgan drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Eli stood watching, a small figure against the bustling market, unaware that by this time tomorrow, his life would be changed forever. Word spread quickly. By afternoon, Frank reported that 17 families had already signed up for the milk subscription program. By evening, the number had doubled. Local businesses joined in, placing standing orders for their cafes and restaurants. Dr. Carter called to inform Morgan that she had spoken with the hospital's financial department. "If the income is stable," she said, "they can work out a payment plan that would allow for continuous treatment." The next morning, Morgan returned to the market to find Eli surrounded by customers. The boy's face showed confusion and a touch of alarm at the sudden interest in his milk. "Morning, Eli," Morgan called as he approached. "Looks like business is good." "I don't understand," Eli said, his voice low so the waiting customers wouldn't hear. "There've never been this many people before," Morgan smiled. "Word gets around when something's worth buying." "But it's just milk." "It's Yoder milk," Morgan corrected gently. "And it seems the town has developed quite a taste for it." As Eli sold his last bottle and began packing up, earlier than ever before, Morgan noticed a new energy in the boy's movements. For the first time since they'd met, Eli's eyes held something beyond quiet resignation. There was a spark there, a dangerous thing that looked almost like hope. Morgan knew that spark came with a risk. Hope, when crushed, could cause more damage than never having hoped at all. But as he watched Eli carefully count his earnings, more than double his usual take, Morgan believed the risk was worth taking. The plan was in motion. The community had rallied. Now came the hardest part, ensuring that Abraham Yoder would accept this help without seeing it as the charity it partially was. Because while the milk was genuinely excellent and fairly priced, the truth was unavoidable. The town of Whispering Creek was finally finding a way to repay years of Amish kindness, one bottle at a time. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate watercolors as Eli hitched the family's horse, Daisy, to the small buggy. His movements were slower than usual, his body stiff from the previous day's chemotherapy session. The doctor had advised rest, but Eli knew Saturday was the busiest market day. His family needed the income more than he needed comfort. His older brother Jacob emerged from the barn, carrying 2 wooden crates filled with freshly bottled milk. "I'll come with you today," Jacob said, loading the crates into the buggy. Eli glanced at him in surprise. "But you're supposed to help Dad fix the fence in the south pasture." Jacob shrugged, his face unreadable in the early light. "He said I should go with you instead. Said you looked tired." A flush of shame crossed Eli's face. He'd tried so hard to hide his weakness, to carry his burden without complaint. "I'm fine." "No one said you weren't," Jacob replied, his voice gentler than usual. "But even you can't be in 2 places at once." The brothers rode in companionable silence, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of Daisy's hooves and the occasional creak of the buggy wheels. The air was crisp with autumn, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. "There's been talk," Jacob said finally as they approached the outskirts of town. "About the Englisher who's been buying all your milk." Eli kept his eyes on the road. "Mr. Freeman, he says his film crew likes it. Every bottle, every day." "It's good milk," Eli said defensively. Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Yes, it is. But that's not all there is to it, is it?" Eli didn't answer, and Jacob didn't press. They completed the journey in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. As they turned into the market parking area, however, both brothers stared in disbelief. Though it was barely 7 o'clock, a line of people already stretched from their usual spot toward the entrance. Men and women of all ages, some whom Eli recognized as regular customers, others he'd never seen before. "What's happening?" Eli whispered. Jacob shook his head, his expression a mixture of confusion and wariness. "I don't know." They set up their stand with practiced efficiency, arranging the milk bottles in neat rows. The crowd waited patiently, exchanging glances and small smiles that Eli couldn't interpret. As soon as they were ready, people began approaching, each purchasing multiple bottles, offering friendly words, some even thanking Eli in ways that made little sense. "My Sarah loves your milk in her morning coffee," said Mrs. Peterson, who had never bought from them before. "We'll be regular customers from now on. We're serving Yoder milk at the cafe now," explained Mr. Tompkins, who owned the diner on Main Street. "Customers say they can taste the difference. By 8:30, half their inventory was gone. By 9, 3/4. Jacob had to make an emergency run back to the farm for more bottles, returning with everything they could spare." Through it all, Eli observed the strange mood of the crowd, almost celebratory, as if they were participating in something beyond a simple transaction. There were nods of encouragement, pats on the shoulder, meaningful glances that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Then he saw Morgan Freeman approaching, accompanied by Dr. Carter. The sight of his oncologist at the market sent a jolt of alarm through Eli. His family's secret, that he was still undergoing treatments despite his father's reluctance, was perilously close to exposure. "Good morning, Eli," Morgan greeted him, his deep voice warm. "Business seems good today." Eli nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "Could we talk privately for a moment?" Dr. Carter asked gently. She looked to Jacob. "Perhaps your brother could mind. The stand?" Jacob hesitated, glancing at Eli for guidance. After a moment's consideration, Eli nodded. "I'll be right back," he promised his brother. They moved to a quiet corner of the market, away from curious ears. Eli's heart hammered in his chest. Was Dr. Carter here to tell him they couldn't continue his treatments without full payment? Had she discovered he'd been setting aside money without his parents' knowledge? Eli, she began, her voice kind but direct. I have some news about your treatment plan. He steeled himself, hands clutching the edges of his coat. The hospital has received payment that covers your next 6 months of therapy. Eli blinked, certain he'd misheard. What? Your treatments are paid for, she repeated. Through your milk sales. Morgan stepped forward. The subscription program has been very successful. People want your family's milk, Eli. They're willing to pay premium prices for it. Eli looked between them, confusion evident on his face. But how? We've never sold enough to... The community has come together, Morgan explained. Restaurants, cafes, families, they're all signing up for regular deliveries. The advance payments are what's covered your medical costs. This isn't charity, Dr. Carter added quickly, seeing the wariness cloud Eli's expression. You're providing a product people value. They're paying a fair price. Eli's mind raced, trying to process this information. For months, he'd carried the weight of his secret fundraising. Knowing the money he made was barely enough for the most basic treatments, the thought that his burden might be lifted, that he could focus on healing rather than hustling to sell every last bottle. A sudden warmth spread through his chest, the unfamiliar sensation of hope. But just as quickly, it was doused by a colder realization. My father, he said softly. He doesn't know. Morgan and Dr. Carter exchanged glances. We wanted to tell you first, Morgan said. But yes, we'll need to explain the program to your father as well. He won't accept it. Eli's voice was barely audible. He'll see it as charity disguised as business. It's not charity, Morgan insisted. It's the community recognizing the value of what your family produces. Eli shook his head, his eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. You don't understand. My father believes that if God wants me to be healed, he will provide the means through our own honest labor, not through the intervention of outsiders. Dr. Carter placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Eli, your honest labor is what's paying for these treatments. The milk is yours. The work is yours. But the plan... Eli looked at Morgan. The plan is yours. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before Morgan could respond, a commotion from the direction of the milk stand caught their attention. Eli turned to see his father's tall figure standing by the buggy, Jacob beside him. Abraham Yoder's face was a mask of controlled anger as he surveyed the crowd, the nearly empty milk crates and the cash box overflowing with bills. Eli, Dr. Carter said urgently, you should go to your father. Eli nodded, his stomach tight with dread. As he took a step forward, Morgan reached out to stop him. Let me talk to him first, Morgan offered. I can explain. No. Eli's voice was firm despite his fear. This is my family, my responsibility. He looked up at Morgan, his young face suddenly seeming much older. Thank you for trying to help, but I need to face this myself. With that, he walked steadily toward his father, every step bringing him closer to a confrontation he'd been dreading for months. Abraham Yoder had been in the middle of repairing fence posts when their neighbor, Samuel Lapp, arrived with the news. The English are buying all the Yoder milk, Samuel had said, his voice careful. They've started some kind of subscription program. People are paying months in advance. Abraham had listened in silence, his hands continuing their work as his mind processed this information. There's more, Samuel added reluctantly. They say it's to pay for the boy's treatments, that the English actor set it up. At this, Abraham had finally set down his tools. What English actor? The famous one. Freeman. He's been asking questions about your family all over town. Now standing in the bustling market, Abraham took in the scene before him. The long line of customers, the knowing looks, the barely concealed pity in their eyes. His sons, one confused, one guilty, caught in the middle of it all. And there was Eli, walking toward him with a strange mixture of fear and defiance. Behind him, the English actor and a woman Abraham recognized as the oncologist from the hospital, watched anxiously. Dad, Eli began as he reached the buggy. "I can explain." Abraham held up a hand, silencing him. "Pack up," he said quietly. "We're going home." "But Dad." "Now, Eli." There was no anger in Abraham's voice, only a firm finality that brooked no argument. Jacob began quickly gathering their things, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Eli stood frozen, torn between obedience and desperation. Mr. Yoder, Abraham, turned to see Morgan approaching, his expression respectful but determined. "This is not the place for this conversation," Abraham said before Morgan could continue. "My family's matters are not for public discussion." "I understand," Morgan replied. "But before you leave, I want you to know that everything done here was done out of respect for your ways. Your son has earned every dollar through honest work." Abraham's gaze was steady. "If you respected our ways, Mr. Freeman, you would not have interfered in matters you do not understand." "What I understand," Morgan said quietly, "is that your son is fighting for his life." For a moment, something flashed in Abraham's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or doubt. But it was quickly replaced by the same impassive expression. "We will discuss this at home," Abraham said to his sons. "Finish packing." As Abraham turned to help load the buggy, Eli caught Morgan's eye. The boy's face was a battlefield of emotions, gratitude warring with fear, hope with resignation. "Thank you," Eli mouthed silently, before climbing into the buggy beside his father. Abraham took the reins, his back straight, his eyes fixed forward. As the buggy pulled away, Morgan noticed how the crowd parted respectfully, their expressions somber. They understood perhaps better than Morgan himself the enormity of what had just happened and what might come next. Dr. Carter appeared at Morgan's side, watching the buggy recede into the distance. "What now?" she asked. Morgan sighed. "Now we wait, and hope that Abraham Yoder loves his son more than he loves his pride." "And if he doesn't?" Morgan turned to look at her, his expression resolute. "Then we find another way. Because that boy deserves to live, Dr. Carter, and I'm not giving up on him." As they stood there, the market gradually returned to its normal rhythms around them. But something had changed. A secret had been exposed, a boundary crossed. The people of Whispering Creek had taken a stand, chosen a side in the silent battle between tradition and necessity. The only question now was whether Abraham Yoder would see their action as the interference of outsiders, or as the hand of God working in mysterious ways. The Yoder home was silent, save for the gentle clinking of silverware against plates. Miriam had prepared a simple dinner, chicken stew with vegetables from their garden, fresh bread, apple butter, but no one seemed to have much appetite. The events at the market hung in the air between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Abraham sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable. Eli kept his eyes fixed on his bowl, occasionally stealing glances at his father's stern profile. Jacob pushed food around his plate, while Miriam moved between the stove and table, refilling glasses of water that no one had emptied. The only sound beyond their eating was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, a family heirloom that had marked the passing of generations of Yoder meals. Its steady rhythm seemed to be counting down to something inevitable. Finally, Abraham set down his spoon and folded his hands on the table. The simple gesture caused everyone to freeze. "Eli," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "tell me what has been happening at the market." Eli swallowed hard, his thin shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly. "People have been buying our milk, Dad, more than before." "And why is that?" Eli hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "Mr. Freeman started buying bottles for his film crew, then others started buying more too." "And the money?" Another hesitation. "I've been using it for my treatments." Abraham's expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened as he clasped his hands tighter. "Without telling me, it wasn't a question," but Eli answered anyway. "Yes, Dad. You went against my wishes." Eli's voice was small but steady. I only sold milk, Dad. I did honest work. And the Englisher? How did he come to organize this arrangement? Eli looked up then, meeting his father's gaze directly for the first time. He asked questions. I answered. I didn't know what he was planning. Abraham turned his attention to Jacob. And you? Did you know of this? Jacob shifted uncomfortably. Not until today. A heavy silence fell over the table once more. Miriam stood by the stove, one hand pressed against her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. The bishop will hear of this, Abraham said finally. We will abide by his counsel. Eli nodded, resigned. The bishop was the spiritual leader of their community, and his word was final in matters of faith and conduct. If he deemed that accepting the increased milk sales constituted forbidden outside help, the arrangement would end. And with it, perhaps, Eli's treatments, may I be excused? Eli asked softly. Abraham nodded once and Eli rose carefully from the table. He moved with the deliberate slowness of someone conserving energy, a 12-year-old boy with the burdens of someone far older. After he left, Jacob abruptly stood. It's not right, he said, then seemed surprised by his own boldness. Abraham looked at his older son, one eyebrow raised. What isn't right, Jacob? Making Eli feel ashamed for trying to get well. Jacob's voice grew stronger. He wasn't asking for charity. He was working hard, harder than he should have to. That is not for you to decide. Then who decides? Jacob's voice cracked with emotion. God? Is it God's will that Eli suffers when help is being offered? Jacob. Miriam's shocked admonishment cut through the tension. Abraham held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes remained fixed on his son. We accept God's will, Jacob. It is not our place to question his plan. And if God's plan includes Mr. Freeman? What then? Jacob's hands trembled slightly, but his gaze remained steady. What if this is the way God has chosen to answer our prayers? For the briefest moment, something flickered across Abraham's face, doubt perhaps, or the shadow of his own unspoken questions. But then it was gone, replaced by the familiar stoic expression. That's enough, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Go check on your brother. Jacob stood for a moment longer, as if debating whether to press his point. Then, with a barely perceptible shake of his head, he left the room. When the door closed behind him, Miriam approached the table. She laid a gentle hand on her husband's shoulder, a rare public display of affection even in the privacy of their home. Abraham, she said softly, I have not questioned your decisions, not when you chose to limit Eli's treatments, not when you refused the hospital's financial aid program. But I am asking you now, please consider what Jacob said. Abraham covered her hand with his own, his touch surprisingly gentle for such calloused fingers. I must do what I believe is right, Miriam, for our family, for our faith. And what of our son? Her voice wavered. What good is preserving our way of life if we lose him in the process? Abraham had no answer for that, and as the grandfather clock continued its steady counting, the question hung between them as heavy as the silence that followed. Morning light streamed through the windows of the Whispering Creek diner, where Morgan sat nursing a cup of coffee. He'd spent a restless night worrying about Eli and wondering if his intervention had made things worse rather than better. Frank Miller slid into the booth across from him, his weathered face grim. No sign of the Yoders at the market today, he reported. Word is Abraham's gone to speak with the bishop. Morgan nodded, having expected as much. And Eli? No one's seen him. Dr. Carter called the farm this morning to check on him, but no one answered. Frank sighed. That's not unusual, though. The Amish don't have phones in their homes. Morgan stared into his coffee, frustration etched in the lines of his face. I thought I was helping, Frank. Now I'm not so sure. You did what any decent person would do, Frank assured him. The rest is up to Abraham and his conscience. The bell above the diner door jingled and both men looked up. Morgan straightened in surprise as Abraham Yoder himself entered, his tall figure commanding attention despite his plain clothing. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Morgan. Without hesitation, Abraham approached their booth. "Mr. Freeman," he said with a small nod, "I would speak with you." Frank made to leave, but Abraham shook his head. "What I have to say can be heard by others. There should be no more secrets." Morgan gestured to the empty seat beside Frank. "Please join us." Abraham sat, his large hands resting on the table. Up close, Morgan could see the toll this situation had taken on the Amish man. New lines around his eyes, a certain weariness in his posture that hadn't been there before. "I've spoken with our bishop," Abraham began without preamble, "and with my family." Morgan nodded, waiting. "You had no right to interfere in our affairs," Abraham continued, his voice level but intense. "Our ways may seem strange to you, but they have sustained us for generations." "I meant no disrespect," Morgan replied calmly. "Perhaps not. But you judged our traditions as lacking, our faith as insufficient." Morgan considered his response carefully. "I saw a boy working to save his own life, Mr. Yoder. A boy who respected your ways so much that he wouldn't ask for help directly, but instead tried to earn his way back to health." Abraham's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Tell me," he said after a moment, "why did you do this? You're a stranger here. Eli is nothing to you." Morgan leaned forward slightly. "Because sometimes we're placed in positions where we can help, Mr. Yoder, and in those moments what we do or don't do defines who we are." A flicker of recognition crossed Abraham's face, as if Morgan had unknowingly echoed some principle of his own faith. "What exactly is this arrangement you've created?" Abraham asked. "It's simple," Morgan explained. "People pay a premium price for quality milk, delivered regularly. The money goes directly to your family as payment for goods received. No charity, no handouts. And the hospital bills? Covered by the advance payments people have made for future deliveries. It's a business transaction, Mr. Yoder. Your son has earned every penny." Abraham was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying Morgan's face as if searching for deceit. "You say that, but we both know the truth. This business only exists because people pity my son." Morgan shook his head, firmly. "I didn't give your son charity. I gave him customers." The simplicity of the statement seemed to catch Abraham off guard. "Your family has a reputation in this town, Mr. Yoder," Morgan continued. "For hard work, for quality, for integrity. People want to buy your milk because it's good milk from good people. The fact that it helps Eli is an added benefit, not the primary motivation." It wasn't entirely true, and perhaps Abraham knew that, but it was true enough to offer a path forward that didn't require either man to compromise their principles entirely. Abraham sat back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "The bishop believes this arrangement walks a fine line," he said finally, "but he has not forbidden it, so long as it remains an honest exchange of goods for payment." Morgan felt a surge of hope. "And what do you believe, Mr. Yoder?" Abraham's gaze was steady. "I believe my son deserves to live, Mr. Freeman, but I also believe in our ways. The question is whether those two beliefs can exist side by side." With that, he stood. "Eli will be at the market tomorrow. I expect you'll want to tell your customers." Morgan nodded, recognizing the concession for what it was. Not a full acceptance, but not a rejection either. A door left deliberately ajar. "Thank you," he said simply. Abraham hesitated, then added, "Eli asked me to tell you that his treatments are scheduled for Tuesday mornings now, in case you wish to know." And with that, he left, the bell jingling behind him. Frank let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be. Not exactly a group hug, but for Abraham Yoder that was practically a welcome speech." Morgan smiled slightly. "He's a proud man, Frank, but he loves his son." "Sometimes that's enough," Frank replied. That night, Abraham couldn't sleep. His conversation with Morgan Freeman played over in his mind, along with the bishop's cautious, approval and Miriam's tearful gratitude when he told her his decision. Around midnight he rose from bed, careful not to wake his wife. He dressed quietly and stepped outside into the cool autumn air. The moon was nearly full, bathing the farm in silver light that transformed the familiar landscape into something almost otherworldly. Abraham walked toward the barn, intending to check on a new calf born the previous day. As he approached, he heard voices, Eli and Jacob, speaking softly as they worked in the milk room attached to the barn. He paused in the shadows, watching through the open door. The brothers were preparing bottles for the next day's market, carefully, washing and filling each one with practiced movements. Despite the late hour and his recent treatment, Eli worked steadily, his thin face serious in concentration. "Do you think people will keep buying?" Eli asked, his voice carrying in the quiet night. Jacob nodded as he sealed a bottle. "They seemed happy to yesterday, and Mr. Freeman says he's arranged for standing orders." "It doesn't seem real," Eli admitted. "All those people buying our milk." "It's good milk," Jacob said simply. "Good enough to pay for chemotherapy?" Eli's tone was doubtful. Jacob set down the bottle he was holding and turned to face his younger brother. "Eli, remember last winter when old Mr. Crawford fell and broke his hip?" Eli nodded. "And Dade took us over there every day for 2 weeks to help with the farm work?" "That was different," Eli said. "He's our neighbor." "And the English family whose barn burned down? The one we helped rebuild in 3 days? That's what the church does, Jacob. We help those in need." "Exactly." Jacob's voice grew passionate. "We help those in need. It's what we've always done. Why is it so wrong for others to do the same for us?" Eli had no answer for that, and the brothers continued their work in silence. From his position, in the shadows, Abraham felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the rigid certainty that had guided his decisions. He'd been so focused on maintaining their separate way of life, on protecting his family from worldly influences, that he'd forgotten the deeper truth of their faith: community, compassion, the giving and receiving of kindness. He stepped into the doorway, and both boys looked up in surprise. "Dad," Jacob said, straightening. "We were just—" Abraham held up a hand. "I heard you talking." Eli's face paled slightly, but he met his father's gaze steadily. "I know you're still not sure about this, Dad, but I promise I'm not taking charity. I'm working for every penny." "I know you are, son," Abraham said softly. Jacob seemed emboldened by his father's mild tone. "Dad, I know you want to do what's right. But how can it be wrong if Eli is working for it?" Abraham was silent for a long moment, looking around the simple milk room with its clean equipment, the rows of bottles filled with the fruits of their labor. Then his eyes settled on Eli, so young, so determined, fighting not just illness but the rigid boundaries of their world. "Perhaps," Abraham said finally, "God's will is more complex than I have understood." The statement hung in the air between them, monumental in its implications. For a man whose life had been guided by unwavering certainty, this admission of doubt, this opening to possibility, was nothing short of revolutionary. "Does this mean—" Eli began, then hesitated, afraid to hope. Abraham placed a hand on his younger son's shoulder. "It means we will continue, with the milk sales, with the treatments, and we will trust that God is guiding us even when the path seems unfamiliar." The relief that washed over Eli's face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Jacob's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he turned quickly back to his work, hiding his emotion. Abraham stayed with them, helping to prepare the remaining bottles. As they worked side by side in the peaceful night, he felt a curious lightness, as if in bending his principles just slightly, he had not broken but instead strengthened his faith. And for the first time since Eli's diagnosis, Abraham allowed himself to believe that perhaps his son would live to become a man after all. As the weeks passed, this tiny crack in Abraham's rigid worldview gradually widened. Not into a chasm, the Yoders remained firmly committed to their Amish ways, but into a doorway just wide enough to let in new possibilities while preserving what mattered most. The changes were subtle, noticeable only to those who knew the family well. Abraham still led prayers before meals and maintained the discipline expected of an Amish father. But now, on treatment days, he would accompany Eli to the hospital himself rather than sending Jacob. He would sit silently in the waiting room, Bible in hand, occasionally engaging in brief conversations with other parents whose children also fought invisible battles in their blood and bones. Miriam, too, seemed to stand a little straighter, as if a great weight had begun to lift from her shoulders. She hummed softly while working in the kitchen, an old hymn that spoke of faith and perseverance. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would rest her hand briefly on Eli's head, her eyes closed in what might have been prayer or simply gratitude. 6 weeks later, the first real snow of winter dusted Whispering Creek in a fine powder that glittered in the morning sun. The farmers' market had moved indoors to the old community hall for the season, tables arranged in neat rows beneath strings of simple lights that gave the cavernous space a warm, festive atmosphere. The Yoder milk stand occupied its usual spot, near the entrance, but there were subtle changes from the first day Morgan had encountered it. A hand-painted sign now advertised subscription deliveries available, and a small notebook lay open for customers to add their names. Most noticeable, however, was Eli himself. Though still thin, his face had lost the hollow, drawn quality that had marked him before. There was color in his cheeks, a brightness in his eyes that spoke of returning health. He moved with more energy, smiled more readily, and while his body still bore the markers of his ongoing treatments, there was an unmistakable air of improvement about him. Jacob worked alongside his brother now, handling the heavier lifting and managing deliveries, which had expanded to include restaurants and stores throughout the county. Their operation had grown from a simple market stall to a small but thriving business, with every bottle still hand-filled and carefully inspected for quality. The small town of Whispering Creek had changed too. There was a renewed sense of connection between its Amish and English residents. Shopkeepers who had barely nodded to their Amish neighbors now greeted them by name. Children who attended different schools somehow found ways to play together in the town square. The invisible barriers that had separated two communities living side by side for generations had not disappeared, but they had softened, become more permeable. Morgan paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. In the weeks since Abraham's decision, he had watched from a respectful distance as the Yoder family found their new balance. The subscription program continued to flourish, ensuring Eli's treatments proceeded without interruption. More importantly, the boy was responding well, his prognosis improving with each hospital visit. The filming schedule had kept Morgan busy, but he'd made time to visit the market at least once a week, checking on Eli's progress and subtly promoting the milk subscription to the film crew and anyone else who would listen. In the rare moments between scenes, he would drive through the countryside, observing the rhythms of Amish life with growing appreciation for its simplicity and purpose. "Looks like you've created quite a phenomenon here," came a voice behind him. Morgan turned to find Dr. Carter, clipboard in hand, surveying the bustling market. "They did this themselves," Morgan replied. "I just helped them find the path." Dr. Carter smiled. "Eli's latest blood work shows remarkable improvement. His body is responding to treatment better than I dared hope." She lowered her voice. "And I've noticed Abraham actually asking questions during appointments now. Last week he wanted to understand exactly how the chemotherapy affects the cancer cells." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a change." "It is," she agreed. "He's finding his own way to reconcile faith with medicine. I suspect he's realized they don't have to be opposing forces." She tucked her clipboard under her arm, her expression growing more serious. "You know, when Eli first came to me, Abraham would barely look at the medical equipment. He'd stand in the corner of the room, arms crossed, almost as if he was afraid the machines might somehow challenge his faith." She shook her head in wonder. "Yesterday he actually watched the IV drip, asked what each bag contained." "Small steps," Morgan observed. "Life-saving ones," Dr. Carter corrected gently. "I've been working with Amish families for 15 years, Mr. Freeman. Change doesn't come easily. What you've accomplished here." She gestured toward the market, bustling around them. "It's extraordinary. The community did the real work. Morgan insisted. Dr. Carter gave him a knowing look. Sometimes all a community needs is someone to show them what's possible. She checked her watch. I should get back to the clinic, but I wanted to thank you before you left town. The film project that had brought Morgan to Pennsylvania was nearly complete. Tomorrow he would board a plane back to Los Angeles, leaving Whispering Creek to its quiet routines. But he couldn't go without one last visit to the milk stand that had changed more than just his stay in town. As he approached, Eli looked up and broke into a wide grin. Mr. Freeman, Jacob said you might be leaving soon. That's right, Morgan confirmed. We wrap filming today. I fly out tomorrow morning. Will your movie show our town? Eli asked, his expression curious. Morgan nodded. Parts of it, though I think the real story of Whispering Creek isn't one that could be captured on film. Eli seemed to understand, his eyes wise beyond his years. I've been wanting to thank you properly, he said, reaching beneath the table. He produced a bottle of milk, but not the regular kind. This one had a special label tied around its neck with twine. Our first batch of chocolate milk, Eli explained proudly. Jacob's idea. We're testing it today, but I wanted you to have the first bottle. Morgan accepted it with genuine pleasure. I'm honored. He studied the handwritten label. Yoder Brothers Dairy Premium Chocolate Milk. Brothers? Morgan asked, noticing the change from the original family designation. Jacob nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. Dad said since Eli and I do most of the work now, we should put our mark on it. The significance wasn't lost on Morgan. In the traditional Amish community, such a change represented not just a business decision, but a shift in family dynamics. An acknowledgement of the boy's growing independence and responsibility. And this was your father's suggestion? Morgan asked, still somewhat surprised by Abraham's flexibility. Jacob exchanged a glance with Eli. Actually, it was our mother's idea first. She suggested it to Dad, and he thought about it for 3 days before agreeing. He smiled slightly. That's how change happens in our family, slowly, with much consideration. Morgan noticed Miriam Yoder across the hall, arranging homemade quilts at another booth. She looked up as if sensing his gaze, and offered a small reserved smile, the quiet acknowledgement of a mother whose burden had lightened in recent weeks. Your mother is quite remarkable, Morgan observed. Eli nodded. She prayed every night for me. I would hear her sometimes when she thought everyone was asleep. He glanced at his mother, his expression softening. Dad makes the decisions, but Ma'am, she holds us together. A young Amish girl of about 8 approached the stand, her small face serious beneath her white prayer cap. She carefully placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. For Eli, she said solemnly, then scampered away before anyone could respond. Eli unfolded the paper to reveal a simple drawing of a boy selling milk, surrounded by smiling stick figures. At the bottom, in careful childish script, were the words, "Get well from Sarah Lapp." Samuel Lapp's daughter, Jacob explained, noting Morgan's curious expression. She's in Eli's Sunday school class. Eli carefully refolded the drawing and placed it in his pocket, but not before Morgan noticed the emotion that briefly crossed his face. These small gestures of community, a child's drawing, a mother's recommendation, a brother's business idea, were gradually reweaving the social fabric around the Yoder family, strengthening them in ways that went beyond physical healing. Morgan uncapped the chocolate milk bottle and took a sip, the rich flavor blending perfectly with the creamy milk. Best milk I ever had, he said with complete sincerity. Eli beamed. It's on the house, a thank you gift. That's not necessary, Morgan began. Please, Eli insisted. We want you to have it. Recognizing the importance of accepting the gesture, Morgan nodded his thanks. I appreciate that, Eli, and I'm glad to see you looking so well. The doctors say I'm responding better than expected, Eli confided. Dr. Carter thinks I might be in remission by spring. The hope in the boy's voice was cautious, but real, not the desperate wish of someone clinging to false promises, but the measured optimism of one who had faced the worst and begun to see a path forward. That's wonderful news, Morgan said, feeling a swell of emotion he hadn't anticipated. Jacob, sensing the moment between them, murmured something about checking their inventory and stepped away, leaving Morgan and Eli alone at the stand. Carter explained how chemotherapy works, Eli said after a moment. How it kills the bad cells but makes me feel terrible while it's working. He looked down at his hands, which no longer trembled as they once had. I used to think that if something hurt that much, it couldn't be God's will, but now I wonder if sometimes healing has to hurt first. Morgan was struck by the depth of reflection from one so young. That's a wise way to look at it. My father says the same thing about our community now, Eli continued. That sometimes we need to experience discomfort to grow stronger. A small smile tugged at his lips. I think he was talking about more than just my illness. How is your father adjusting to all this? Morgan asked carefully. Eli considered the question. He still prays for guidance every morning, still reads the Bible before bed, still leads our family in the old ways. He paused. But last week when we delivered milk to the hospital cafeteria, he came inside with us. He'd never done that before. The small step spoke volumes about Abraham's evolving perspective, not abandoning tradition but finding room within it for new experiences. And there's something else, Eli added, his voice lowering slightly. Jacob is thinking about becoming a veterinarian. Morgan's eyebrows rose in surprise. Among the Amish, higher education was generally discouraged, with formal schooling typically ending at the 8th grade. Dad doesn't know yet, Eli clarified quickly, but Jacob has been reading books from the town library. Dr. Miller, he's the vet who helps with our cows. He's been teaching Jacob things. His eyes shone with admiration for his older brother. Jacob says that if God made the animals, then learning to heal them must be part of his plan. Eli hesitated, then added, being sick changed how I see things too. Before I just accepted what was. Now I wonder about how things could be different. In what way? Morgan asked. I want to learn more, Eli said simply. Not just about farming or woodworking, but about the world. About medicine, maybe. About how bodies work and how they heal. His eyes were bright with curiosity that had perhaps always been there but now had found purpose. I don't think that means I can't still be Amish. I think it might mean I can be a different kind of Amish. The profound nature of this statement, coming from a 12-year-old boy in a community that prized conformity and tradition, was not lost on Morgan. This, perhaps more than anything else, demonstrated the ripple effects of what had begun as a simple act of kindness. Before Morgan could respond, he caught sight of a tall figure at the entrance to the hall. Abraham Yoder stood watching them, his expression as impassive as ever, but his posture somehow less rigid than when Morgan had first met him. Your father's here, Morgan noted. Eli glanced over. He comes to the market now sometimes, says he likes to see how the business is growing. Morgan recognized this for what it was, another small but significant shift. Abraham was not just allowing the milk sales to continue, he was taking an interest, perhaps even pride, in what his sons had built. I should go speak with him before I leave, Morgan said. Eli nodded. He would appreciate that, I think, even if he doesn't say so. Morgan smiled. I've learned to read between the lines with your father. As he approached Abraham, Morgan was struck by how much their positions had reversed from their first meeting. Then, he had been the intruder, questioning the Amish man's ways. Now he was the one preparing to depart, while Abraham stood firmly, rooted in a community that had expanded to include new possibilities. Mr. Yoder. Morgan greeted him, extending his hand. Abraham shook it with a firm grip. Mr. Freeman. I wanted to say goodbye. We've finished filming, and I'll be leaving tomorrow. Abraham nodded. Your work here is complete then? The double meaning wasn't lost on Morgan. In more ways than one, yes. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Eli and Jacob served customers at their stand. The easy rhythm of their movements, the quiet confidence with which Eli now interacted with the townspeople, these were the real measures of success, far more meaningful than any film. The bishop visited yesterday, Abraham said unexpectedly. He spoke of how the English and Amish communities have grown closer through this situation. Is that a good thing? Morgan asked carefully. Abraham considered the question. Our ways are different. They will remain different, but perhaps... He paused, choosing his words with care. Perhaps we are not as separate as I once believed. Coming from Abraham Yoder, this was a profound admission. Not a rejection of his faith or traditions, but an acknowledgement that boundaries need not always be barriers. The milk business seems to be thriving, Morgan observed, nodding toward the stand where a small line had formed. It provides well, Abraham acknowledged. Better than I expected. He hesitated, then added, Jacob has ideas for expanding. Cheese, perhaps, butter. He has a mind for business, that one. And you're considering it? I am listening, Abraham clarified. It is not our way to rush into change. Morgan smiled at the subtle distinction. Of course. An older Amish man approached them, his long white beard reaching nearly to his chest. Abraham straightened slightly, a gesture of respect that identified the man as someone of importance. The bishop, Morgan guessed. Abraham, the older man, greeted him, then turned curious eyes toward Morgan. And this must be the Englisher I've heard so much about. Abraham made the introductions formally. Bishop Stoltzfus, this is Morgan Freeman. Mr. Freeman, this is Bishop Samuel Stoltzfus, our community's spiritual leader. Morgan nodded respectfully. It's an honor to meet you, sir. The bishop studied him with keen eyes that belied his advanced age. Our community owes you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Freeman. Not just for helping the Yoder boy, but for doing so in a way that respects our beliefs. Morgan was surprised by the open acknowledgement. I simply saw a need and tried to meet it, in the most appropriate way. Humility, too, the bishop observed with a slight smile. A virtue we value highly. He turned to Abraham. Your son's business venture has been a blessing to many. The hospital staff speaks highly of the quality of Yoder milk. And I understand, Eli's health is improving. By God's grace, Abraham replied, but with none of the defensiveness that might have colored such a statement weeks ago. Indeed, the bishop nodded. And sometimes God's grace flows through unexpected channels. He glanced meaningfully at Morgan. I should greet the others. Peace be with you both. As the bishop moved away, Morgan saw a subtle relaxation in Abraham's posture. The relief of a man who had feared judgment but received blessing instead. Eli looks well, Morgan observed after a moment. God has been merciful, Abraham replied, but then added with the barest hint of a smile, and the doctors say his blood counts are improving. Morgan smiled at the Amish man's subtle acknowledgement of medical science alongside divine intervention. I'm glad to hear it. Last week, Abraham said, his voice dropping slightly, Eli asked if he might return to school next year, if his health continues to improve. There was a note of something like wonder in the father's voice. 6 months ago, I feared he would not see another spring. Now he speaks of next year's schooling. The emotion behind the simple statement was all the more powerful for Abraham's restraint in expressing it. Children are remarkably resilient, Morgan offered. Yes, Abraham agreed. And perhaps fathers can learn resilience too, in their own way. A young Amish couple approached, pushing a baby carriage. The woman smiled shyly at Abraham and asked a question in Pennsylvania Dutch. Abraham responded in kind, then gestured toward Eli and Jacob's stand. The couple nodded gratefully and moved in that direction. New parents, Abraham explained. Their first child. They wanted to know where to find the best milk. And you recommended your sons, Morgan noted with approval. It is the best, Abraham stated simply, without pride but with quiet certainty. And they need the business more than the other dairy farmers. This practical acceptance of the new reality, that his sons were now businessmen in their own right, revealed how far Abraham had come from the rigid patriarch Morgan had first encountered. Abraham turned to face Morgan directly, his expression solemn but no longer guarded. My son would not be here without your interference, Mr. Freeman. I cannot say I approve of your methods, but I cannot deny the results. I only opened a door, Mr. Yoder. You were the one who chose to walk through it. Abraham seemed to appreciate this framing. With the slightest of nods, he said, "May God go with you on your journey home. And may he remain with your family," Morgan replied. As Abraham moved away toward his sons, Morgan felt a sense of completion wash over him. There were no dramatic speeches, no tearful embraces. Such displays would have been foreign to the Yoder's way of life. Instead, there was this quiet acknowledgement, this simple exchange of respect between two men who had found common ground in their concern for a child's well-being. Frank Miller appeared at Morgan's side, hands thrust deep in his coat pockets. "Quite a difference from when you first blew into town," he observed, nodding toward the Yoder stand. "In more ways than one," Morgan agreed. "You know," Frank said, "the subscription list keeps growing. 3 more restaurants in Harrisburg signed up last week. The Millers, remember I told you about them, lost their daughter. They're helping with deliveries now." He shook his head in quiet amazement. "It started with one sick boy and a bunch of milk bottles, and now it's bringing the whole community together." Morgan smiled. "Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference." "You coming back this way again?" Frank asked. "I don't know," Morgan admitted, "but I'll be keeping in touch. I want to hear how Eli's doing." "He'll be fine," Frank said with certainty. "That boy's got grit, and now he's got a chance to use it." They were interrupted by Doris from the diner, who approached with a small cardboard box. "Almost forgot," she said, handing it to Morgan. "Your pie for the road. Apple crumbs, still warm from the oven." "I didn't order," Morgan began. "On the house," Doris insisted with a wink. "Just like you've been doing with those coffees for the road crew these past weeks. What goes around comes around, Mr. Freeman." As she walked away, Frank chuckled. "See what you started? People in this town never used to give things away. Now everybody's finding excuses to be generous." "Sounds like a problem that's good to have," Morgan replied with a smile. They were joined by several other townspeople, each with their own small story of how the Milk for Health initiative had affected them. The principal of the local school mentioned that they now used Yoder milk exclusively in their cafeteria. The owner of the Whispering Creek Inn had started offering local dairy products as a selling point for tourists. But the most moving story came from Mrs. Crawford, the elderly woman whose hip had been broken the previous winter. "Eli still brings me milk every Tuesday," she said, her eyes bright with emotion. "But now he stays to visit, tells me about his treatments, asks about my physical therapy. We're healing together, that boy and I." Morgan lingered a while longer, watching the everyday miracle of community unfold around him. Customers greeted Eli by name, asking after his health with genuine concern. Jacob discussed delivery schedules with local business owners, his confidence growing with each interaction. And Abraham, standing nearby, observed it all with the measured pride of a father seeing his sons come into their own. Miriam Yoder approached Morgan, a small package wrapped in brown paper in her hands. "For your journey," she said simply, presenting it to him. Morgan accepted it, touched by the unexpected gesture from the usually reserved woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Yoder." "My husband is not a man who changes easily," she said quietly. "But for Eli, he found a way, and for that we are grateful." The simple statement held the weight of months of silent worry, of a mother's deepest fears gradually giving way to cautious hope. She hesitated, then added in a voice so soft Morgan had to lean in to hear, "I prayed for help. Not for a miracle, just for help. And then you arrived in our town." Her eyes, direct and clear, held his. "Sometimes the answer to prayer doesn't look the way we expect it to." Before Morgan could respond, she stepped back, returning to the modest reserve that governed Amish social interactions. With a small nod, she rejoined her husband at the milk stand. When it was time to leave, Morgan didn't make a fuss of goodbyes. He simply raised his bottle of chocolate milk in a silent toast to the Yoder brothers, then turned toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he glanced back one last time. Abraham stood by his sons now, his hand resting lightly on Eli's shoulder. Their eyes met across the room, and Abraham inclined his head in a single, deliberate nod, a gesture that contained more genuine gratitude than any effusive thank you could have conveyed. Morgan returned the nod, then stepped out into the winter sunlight, the bottle of Yoder Brothers milk still in his hand. In his car, he carefully unwrapped Miriam's package. Inside was a small, exquisitely crafted quilt, no larger than a placemat, but stitched with the same care as the full-size ones she sold. The pattern was simple but beautiful, blue and white pieces arranged in a star formation. Tucked into the folds was a note card with a single line written in neat, precise handwriting. Faith finds a way. Morgan traced the stitches with his finger, understanding the hours of work that had gone into this small token, and the depth of feeling behind it. In the Amish world, where words were used sparingly, actions carried profound meaning. This tiny quilt represented not just gratitude but acceptance of him, of the changes he had catalyzed, of the bridge he had helped build between two worlds. As he drove through town one last time, Morgan noticed small details he might have missed before: an Amish buggy hitched outside the modern pharmacy, English children waving to an Amish family, passing in their wagon the new sign at the diner advertising local Amish dairy products used here. Separate worlds still, but with more points of connection than before. He had come to Whispering Creek looking for a film location and found something else entirely. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts are the smallest ones, a single choice that sets in motion waves of change no one could have predicted. As Morgan drove away from the town, snow beginning to fall more heavily around him, he thought of Eli Yoder selling milk to save his own life, and of an Amish father, learning that faith could be flexible without breaking. He thought of a community coming together not through grand gestures but through the steady exchange of goods and goodwill, finding a path between tradition and necessity. These were not the kinds of stories that made for dramatic Hollywood films. They were quieter, more nuanced, told in nods and half-smiles and bottles of milk passed from hand to hand. But they were no less powerful for their subtlety. Morgan took another sip of the chocolate milk, rich, sweet, and undeniably the best he'd ever tasted. Like everything the Yoders did, it was crafted with care and integrity, a simple product, elevated by the values behind it. The snow fell thicker now, beginning to blanket the countryside in white. But behind him, Morgan knew, Eli Yoder stood at his milk stand, stronger than he had been 6 weeks ago, surrounded by a family and community that had found a way to preserve what mattered most, while letting go of what did not. And in that balance, between holding on and letting go, between tradition and change, between faith and adaptation, lay the quiet miracle Morgan would remember long after he'd forgotten the details of the film that had brought him to Pennsylvania. Some encounters changed everything, not with thunderclaps and drama, but with the steady persistence of kindness finding its way, like water through stone. 6 months later, a small package arrived at Morgan's Los Angeles home. Inside was a bottle of Yoder Brothers Dairy strawberry milk, carefully packed in ice with a photograph tucked alongside it. The picture showed Eli, noticeably healthier, standing beside Jacob in front of a newly painted delivery wagon. On the back was written, "In remission, thank you, EY." A letter accompanied the package, written in the careful script of someone for whom English was a second language. "Mr. Freeman, our bishop says it is proper to inform you of our news. Eli's doctors have declared him in remission. The treatments will continue for some time, but with hope rather than desperation. Our dairy business now supplies milk to 3 counties, and Jacob has begun learning cheesemaking from our cousin in Lancaster. We remain true to our faith and our ways, but perhaps with eyes that see more clearly how God works through all people, not just those who worship as we do." The enclosed milk is Eli's new recipe. He thought you should be the first to taste it. May God bless your journey, Abraham Yoder Morgan smiled as he placed the photograph on his mantle, next to the small quilt that had traveled with him from Whispering Creek. The simple message, not effusive but deeply meaningful coming from a man of so few words, confirmed what he had hoped. that the bridges built would remain standing long after he had left. 1 year after his departure from Whispering Creek, Morgan returned for a brief visit. The premiere of his film had been well received, but he found himself more excited about seeing the Yoders than about the critical acclaim. He arrived at the market, now permanently housed in the community hall due to the business's growth, to find not just Eli and Jacob, but an entire section dedicated to Yoder Brothers dairy products. Milk in various flavors, freshly made butter, and simple cheeses lined the shelves. A small sign described their traditional production methods and commitment to quality. And there was Eli, no longer frail but sturdy and tall for his 13 years, his face healthy and sun-browned from working outdoors again. When he spotted Morgan, his face lit up with uncontained joy. "Mr. Freeman, you came back." Morgan found himself enveloped in an enthusiastic embrace, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in their early encounters. "I had to see how you were doing," he said, stepping back to take in the boy's transformation. "And to try this strawberry milk I've heard so much about." Eli beckoned him toward a small table where Jacob was demonstrating the cheese-making process to a group of fascinated customers. "Jacob, look who's here." Jacob looked up, his serious face breaking into a rare, wide smile. At 19, he had grown taller, his shoulders broader from farm work, but his eyes held something new, a spark of intellectual curiosity that had been carefully nurtured over the past year. "Mr. Freeman," he greeted, wiping his hands on his apron. "We weren't sure you'd remember us once you were back in Hollywood." "How could I forget?" Morgan replied warmly. "Besides, not many people send me strawberry milk in the mail." As the brothers showed Morgan around their expanded business, he noticed several young Amish men and women working alongside them, carefully packaging cheese or preparing milk deliveries. What had begun as one boy's desperate attempt to pay for his own treatment had grown into a small enterprise that now provided work for others in the community. "There's someone who wants to see you," Eli said, leading Morgan toward the back of the hall where a small office had been constructed. Inside, Abraham sat at a simple desk, ledger books open before him. He looked up as they entered, and Morgan was struck by the subtle changes in the man. The same stern features, but somehow softened, as if the rigid lines of his life had been gently smudged to allow for new patterns. "Mr. Freeman," Abraham said, rising to shake his hand. "We are pleased you have returned." The formal words couldn't hide the genuine welcome in his voice. He gestured to the ledgers. "Our business has grown. We now supply milk to 37 businesses and over 100 families." Morgan nodded, understanding that for Abraham this was not boasting but simply sharing facts that brought him quiet satisfaction. "That's impressive growth for 1 year." "The Lord provides," Abraham said, his customary response, but then added, with the barest hint of humor, sometimes through Hollywood actors. It was perhaps the closest thing to a joke Morgan had ever heard from the solemn Amish man, and it spoke volumes about how far they had all come. As they walked out of the office, Morgan spotted Miriam across the hall, supervising a group of young women who were setting up a display of handmade quilts and crafts next to the dairy products. A savvy business expansion that capitalized on the growing customer base. "Your mother seems to have found her own role in the business," Morgan observed to Eli. The boy nodded. "She manages all the crafts now. Says if people are coming for milk, they might as well take home a potholder too." He grinned. "She has good business sense, just like Jacob." Morgan was struck by how casually Eli credited his mother's intelligence, a subtle but significant change from the strictly patriarchal structure he had first encountered in the Yoder household. As they continued their tour, Eli shared news of the community. The local hospital had established a partnership with the Amish elders to better understand and accommodate their cultural needs. Several English families had begun attending community work events, helping with barn raisings and harvests in exchange for learning traditional crafting techniques. The barriers between the two worlds remained, but they had become more permeable, allowing for respectful exchange rather than rigid separation. "And your health?" Morgan asked finally, the question that had brought him back to Whispering Creek. Eli's smile widened. "Dr. Carter says I'm officially in long-term remission. I still go for checkups, but..." He shrugged, a gesture of cautious optimism. I feel good. Strong. He looked it. The hollow-eyed boy with trembling hands had been replaced by this vibrant young person. His future no longer measured in months, but in years. Possibilities stretching ahead of him like an open road. Before Morgan left, Abraham invited him to join their family for dinner, an unprecedented honor for an outsider. The Yoder farmhouse was much as Morgan remembered it, simple and meticulously maintained, but with small changes that reflected their evolving circumstances. A new shelf in the living room held medical and veterinary textbooks, Jacob's growing collection. A row of milk bottles in various stages of development lined a kitchen windowsill. Eli's experimental flavors. The meal was simple but abundant. Roast chicken, vegetables from their garden, fresh bread with butter and cheese they had made themselves. They ate by lamplight, electricity still absent from their home despite their business success. Some traditions, Morgan realized, would remain unchanged, anchoring the family even as they adapted in other ways. After the meal, as dusk settled, over the farm, Morgan walked with Abraham to the barn where Eli and Jacob were completing the evening milking. The familiar rhythm of their work, the quiet conversations between the brothers, the gentle sounds of the animals, all created a scene of profound peace. I sometimes wonder, Abraham said suddenly, his voice low, what would have happened if you had not come to our market that day? Morgan looked at him, surprised by the rare moment of reflection. Eli would have died, Abraham continued simply, stating what both men knew to be true. My pride would have cost me my son. You found your way, Morgan offered. You made the hard choice. Abraham nodded slowly. The hardest choice was admitting I could be wrong, that God's plan might include help from places I had been taught to avoid. He looked at Morgan directly. Our ways are still our ways, but perhaps they can bend without breaking. As the evening shadows lengthened, Morgan prepared to leave. Eli emerged from the barn, insisting on walking him to his car. Will you come back again? The boy asked as they reached the vehicle. I hope so, Morgan replied honestly. This place has become special to me. Eli nodded, understanding. Dr. Carter says I wouldn't be here without you, that by the time I was selling milk, my cancer was already too advanced for delay. Morgan felt a chill at how close they had come to a very different ending. You did all the hard work, Eli. I just helped arrange better payment for your milk. The boy smiled at the familiar framing that had allowed his father to accept help without compromising his principles. Then, with a sudden seriousness beyond his years, he asked, Do you think I could do that too? Help someone the way you helped me? I think you already are, Morgan answered. Every bottle of milk you sell, every person you employ, every barrier you help break down, it all matters, Eli. It all helps someone, somewhere. As Morgan drove away from the Yoder farm for the second time, the setting sun turning the fields to gold, he thought about the ripples that continued to spread from that first encounter at a market stall. Ripples that had changed not just one boy's life, but an entire community's understanding of itself. Eli's story would continue without him now, as it should. But he would carry with him the memory of a boy with trembling hands and unwavering determination, selling milk bottle by bottle to save his own life. A boy who had grown into a young man with a future as rich and promising as the land his family had farmed for generations. And perhaps years from now, when the film was long forgotten, Morgan would find himself in another small town, at another crossroads of need and opportunity. And he would remember that sometimes the smallest actions cast the longest shadows, and that kindness, like faith, always finds a way. The end. And I'm glad to see you looking so well. The doctors say I'm responding better than expected, Eli confided. Dr. Carter thinks I might be in remission by spring. The hope in the boy's voice was cautious but real, not the desperate wish of someone clinging to false promises, but the measured optimism of one who had faced the worst and begun to see a path forward. That's wonderful news, Morgan said, feeling a swell of emotion he hadn't anticipated. Jacob, sensing the moment between them, murmured something about checking their inventory and stepped away, leaving Morgan and Eli alone at the stand. Dr. Carter explained how chemotherapy works, Eli said after a moment. How it kills the bad cells but makes me feel terrible while it's working. He looked down at his hands, which no longer trembled as they once had. I used to think that if something hurt that much, it couldn't be God's will, but now I wonder if sometimes healing has to hurt first. Morgan was struck by the depth of reflection from one so young. That's a wise way to look at it. My father says the same thing about our community now, Eli continued. That sometimes we need to experience discomfort to grow stronger. A small smile tugged at his lips. I think he was talking about more than just my illness. How is your father adjusting to all this? Morgan asked carefully. Eli considered the question. He still prays for guidance every morning, still reads the Bible before bed, still leads our family in the old ways. He paused. But last week, when we delivered milk to the hospital cafeteria, he came inside with us. He'd never done that before. The small step spoke volumes about Abraham's evolving perspective, not abandoning tradition but finding room within it for new experiences. And there's something else, Eli added, his voice lowering slightly. Jacob is thinking about becoming a veterinarian. Morgan's eyebrows rose in surprise. Among the Amish, higher education was generally discouraged, with formal schooling typically ending at the 8th grade. Dad doesn't know yet, Eli clarified quickly. But Jacob has been reading books from the town library. Dr. Miller, he's the vet who helps with our cows. He's been teaching Jacob things. His eyes shone with admiration for his older brother. Jacob says that if God made the animals, then learning to heal them must be part of his plan. Before Morgan could respond, he caught sight of a tall figure at the entrance to the hall. Abraham Yoder stood watching them, his expression as impassive as ever, but his posture somehow less rigid than when Morgan had first met him. Your father's here, Morgan noted. Eli glanced over. He comes to the market now sometimes. Says he likes to see how the business is growing. Morgan recognized this for what it was, another small but significant shift. Abraham was not just allowing the milk sales to continue. He was taking an interest, perhaps even pride, in what his sons had built. I should go speak with him before I leave, Morgan said. Eli nodded. He would appreciate that, I think. Even if he doesn't say so, Morgan smiled. I've learned to read between the lines with your father. As he approached Abraham, Morgan was struck by how much their positions had reversed from their first meeting. Then, he had been the intruder, questioning the Amish man's ways. Now, he was the one preparing to depart, while Abraham stood firmly, rooted in a community that had expanded to include new possibilities. Mr. Yoder, Morgan greeted him, extending his hand. Abraham shook it with a firm grip. Mr. Freeman, I wanted to say goodbye. We've finished filming and I'll be leaving tomorrow. Abraham nodded. Your work here is complete then. The double meaning wasn't lost on Morgan. In more ways than one, yes. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Eli and Jacob served customers at their stand. The easy rhythm of their movements, the quiet confidence with which Eli now interacted with the townspeople, these were the real measures of success, far more meaningful than any film. The bishop visited yesterday, Abraham said unexpectedly. He spoke of how the English and Amish communities have grown closer through this situation. Is that a good thing? Morgan asked carefully. Abraham considered the question. Our ways are different. They will remain different, but perhaps... He paused, choosing his words with care. Perhaps we are not as separate as I once believed. Coming from Abraham Yoder, this was a profound admission. Not a rejection of his faith or traditions, but an acknowledgement that boundaries need not always be barriers. The milk business seems to be thriving, Morgan observed, nodding toward the stand, where a small line had formed. It provides well, Abraham acknowledged. Better than I expected. He hesitated, then added, Jacob has ideas for expanding. Cheese, perhaps. Butter. He has a mind for business, that one. And you're considering it? I am listening, Abraham clarified. It is not our way to rush into change. Morgan smiled at the subtle distinction. Of course. Eli looks well, he observed after a moment. God has been merciful, Abraham replied, but then added, with the barest hint of a smile, and the doctors say his blood counts are improving. Morgan smiled at the Amish man's subtle acknowledgement of medical science alongside divine intervention. I'm glad to hear it. Last week, Abraham said, his voice dropping slightly, Eli asked if he might return to school next year, if his health continues to improve. There was a note of something like wonder in the father's voice. 6 months ago, I feared he would not see another spring. Now he speaks of next year's schooling. The emotion behind the simple statement was all the more powerful for Abraham's restraint in expressing it. Children are remarkably resilient, Morgan offered. Yes, Abraham agreed, and perhaps fathers can learn resilience too in their own way. Abraham turned to face Morgan directly, his expression solemn but no longer guarded. My son would not be here without your interference, Mr. Freeman. I cannot say I approve of your methods, but I cannot deny the results. I only opened a door. Mr. Yoder, you were the one who chose to walk through it. Abraham seemed to appreciate this framing. With the slightest of nods, he said, May God go with you on your journey home. And may he remain with your family, Morgan replied. As Abraham moved away toward his sons, Morgan felt a sense of completion wash over him. There were no dramatic speeches, no tearful embraces. Such displays would have been foreign to the Yoder's way of life. Instead, there was this quiet acknowledgement, this simple exchange of respect between two men who had found common ground in their concern for a child's well-being. Frank Miller appeared at Morgan's side, hands thrust deep in his coat pockets. Quite a difference from when you first blew into town, he observed, nodding toward the Yoder stand. In more ways than one, Morgan agreed. You know, Frank said, the subscription list keeps growing. 3 more restaurants in Harrisburg signed up last week. The Millers, remember I told you about them, lost their daughter? They're helping with deliveries now. He shook his head in quiet amazement. It started with one sick boy and a bunch of milk bottles, and now it's bringing the whole community together. Morgan smiled. Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. You coming back this way again? Frank asked. I don't know, Morgan admitted. But I'll be keeping in touch. I want to hear how Eli's doing. He'll be fine, Frank said with certainty. That boy's got grit. And now he's got a chance to use it. Morgan lingered a while longer, watching the everyday miracle of community unfold around him. Customers greeted Eli by name, asking after his health with genuine concern. Jacob discussed delivery schedules with local business owners, his confidence growing with each interaction. And Abraham, standing nearby, observed it all with the measured pride of a father seeing his sons come into their own. Miriam Yoder approached Morgan, a small package wrapped in brown paper in her hands. For your journey, she said simply, presenting it to him. Morgan accepted it, touched by the unexpected gesture from the usually reserved woman. Thank you, Mrs. Yoder. My husband is not a man who changes easily, she said quietly. But for Eli, he found a way. And for that, we are grateful. The simple statement held the weight of months of silent worry, of a mother's deepest fears gradually giving way to cautious hope. When it was time to leave, Morgan didn't make a fuss of goodbyes. He simply raised his bottle of chocolate milk, in a silent toast to the Yoder brothers, then turned toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he glanced back one last time. Abraham stood by his sons now, his hand resting lightly on Eli's shoulder. Their eyes met across the room, and Abraham inclined his head in a single deliberate nod, a gesture that contained more genuine gratitude than any effusive thank you could have conveyed. Morgan returned the nod, then stepped out into the winter sunlight, the bottle of Yoder Brothers milk still in his hand. In his car, he carefully unwrapped Miriam's package. Inside was a small, exquisitely crafted quilt, no larger than a placemat, but stitched with the same care as the full-sized one she sold. The pattern was simple but beautiful, blue and white, pieces arranged in a star formation. Tucked into the folds was a note card with a single line written in neat, precise handwriting. Faith finds a way. Morgan traced the stitches with his finger, understanding the hours of work that had gone into this small token, and the depth of feeling behind it. In the Amish world, where words were used sparingly, actions carried profound meaning. This tiny quilt represented not just gratitude but acceptance of him, of the changes he had catalyzed, of the bridge he had helped build between two worlds. He had come to Whispering Creek looking for a film location and found something else entirely. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts are the smallest ones, a single choice that sets in motion waves of change no one could have predicted. As Morgan drove away from the town, snow beginning to fall more heavily around him, he thought of Eli Yoder selling milk to save his own life, and of an Amish father learning that faith could be flexible without breaking. He thought of a community coming together not through grand gestures but through the steady exchange of goods and goodwill, finding a path between tradition and necessity. These were not the kinds of stories that made for dramatic Hollywood films. They were quieter, more nuanced, told in nods and half smiles and bottles of milk passed from hand to hand. But they were no less powerful for their subtlety. Morgan took another sip of the chocolate milk, rich, sweet, and undeniably the best he'd ever tasted. Like everything the Yoders did, it was crafted with care and integrity. A simple product, elevated by the values behind it. The snow fell thicker now, beginning to blanket the countryside in white. But behind him, Morgan knew. Eli Yoder stood at his milk stand, stronger than he had been 6 weeks ago, surrounded by a family and community that had found a way to preserve what mattered most while letting go of what did not. And in that balance, between holding on and letting go, between tradition and change, between faith and adaptation, lay the quiet miracle Morgan would remember long after he'd forgotten the details of the film that had brought him to Pennsylvania. Some encounters changed everything, not with thunderclaps and drama, but with the steady persistence of kindness finding its way, like water through stone. 6 months later, a small package arrived at Morgan's Los Angeles home. Inside was a bottle of Yoder Brothers dairy, strawberry milk, carefully packed in ice with a photograph tucked alongside it. The picture showed Eli, noticeably healthier, standing beside Jacob in front of a newly painted delivery wagon. On the back was written, "In remission, thank you, E.Y." Morgan smiled as he placed the photograph on his mantel, next to the small quilt that had traveled with him from Whispering Creek. Eli's story would continue without him now, as it should, but he would carry with him the memory of a boy with trembling hands and unwavering determination, selling milk bottle by bottle to save his own life. And perhaps years from now, when the film was long forgotten, he would find himself in another small town, at another crossroads of need and opportunity, and he would remember that sometimes the smallest actions cast the longest shadows. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.